Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. My name is Ronsley, and this is episode number 357 of We Are Podcast. As always, this is a podcast for business owners that want to grow their business using a podcast and learn how to use it for credibility, growing revenue, growing audience, and all the other things that it returns on. Today, I have Callum Laing in the house. Now, he is a genius. Let me just tell you what he does. He is the founder of Veblen Director Program, partner at Unity Group, and he's the former CEO and chair of MBH Corporation PLC, a successful European small business conglomerate. He has been in the space and has written and published multiple books. He's coming out with his new book. We're talking about navigating entrepreneurial journeys, and specifically in this episode, he talks about this unique podcast that he had created and what it did and how it was so simple to make, but it might not be something that most podcast coaches would recommend. It was very little of his time, in fact, none of his time. And once he created the system around it, it was returning in these really unique ways. And we break that particular method down and something that you could implement, or you could implement a variation of this to help you save time, money, but also do it in a way that keeps your energy. Maybe this might be something that could help you. It's a very unique way of doing a podcast for your business. This is Callum Laing. This is episode number 357. Enjoy.
You can't find your voice if you don't use it. This is We Are Podcast, formerly called Should I Start a Podcast? A podcast for podcasters who want a podcast that grows their business and brand. How many times can we say podcast in a sentence? Here's your host, Ronsley. He has interviewed more than 1,500 people, has been listened to over 5 million times in 133 countries. He has helped create over 1,100 podcasts for businesses, brands, and personalities. He's been doing this for more than a decade. Get ready to take notes. Enjoy the show.
Welcome to the show. It's good to talk to someone that's at peace with the world, considering how much dichotomy exists. Let's talk about your entrepreneurial journey first before we get into the podcasting side of things. I mean, you've got 25 years of experience, and for the last 10 years, you've been focusing mainly on helping small businesses utilize, the capital markets. So maybe let's talk about the philosophy around entrepreneurship that you have, and what you've seen in the world is what works and what doesn't work.
I started off as a small entrepreneur. Actually, it was one of those journeys where I got lucky. I set up a recruitment company for network engineers at the height of the dot-com boom in Europe. So work grew very successfully. Of course, at the age of 24, as I was at the time, I thought I was incredibly clever and good looking. And then the dot-com bubble burst, and I discovered I was nearly as clever or good looking as I thought I was. By then I was kind of broken and could only be an entrepreneur after that. So yeah, kept building businesses. And then about 10 years ago, in fact, I think we initially connected through Key Person of Influence. So I was working with Dan Priestley and I helped him launch Key Person of Influence in Asia, which was a great fun, great experience, great people through that. And then I connected with a gentleman called Jeremy Harbour, you also know. We were on his boat the other day. And him and I started working together on an idea of basically, the world was obsessed with tech startups and they were getting crazy valuations. But what our network was made up of boring businesses, old economy, cash generating, just dull but good businesses. And the founders were kind of stuck because nobody will invest in a construction company. It's just not exciting enough. There's not enough growth potential. But most of these companies are too small to go public, and they're just kind of stuck in this limbo. And so what we started doing was taking groups of them, putting them under a wrapper and taking the holding company public. But the key difference, whereas private equity would buy the construction company, fire the founder, get rid of half the staff, settle it with a bunch of debt, and then try and flip it to the next person. We didn't touch it. We leave the founder in charge, their company, it's their culture, it's their hiring and firing. But now when they go and pitch for business, they're part of a global publicly listed company. When they want to attract good staff, they can offer them stock options. If they want to do their own acquisitions, they've got a currency to do it. So yeah, we've been doing that for about a decade now. And I like to think we've made every possible mistake going along the way, smashed our heads repeatedly against the wall. But yeah, it's a very good solution for small business owners.
Let's talk about these dull but good businesses, because they are pretty much, they've made up the ecosystem before online came along. And it feels like the bright and new shiny thing is online, even though some of them have no foundations to them. Like I've seen a lot of people who've had podcasts themselves and become, podcast experts overnight. Same with social. They've had a Facebook account and landed up becoming, social media experts. Now AI is the new thing. It's quite funny to watch because, when you're talking to someone who is pretending or they're so convinced that they're the expert because online space is like that. And then when I'm in the room as a computer scientist, you're like, you're full of shit right now. Like you're making up stuff that doesn't really exist. But when you talk about the dull businesses, they have these foundations in business because they've been operating in the business world for a while. What is holding them back when it comes to the new world?
I think part of the challenge is that people think that they're being held back. And I learned this lesson very early on. I had a mentor of mine who was a woman that had a marketing agency that was incredibly successful, below the line marketing agency. She had about 500 staff, absolutely smashing it. And I used to go buy her lunch about once a quarter and try and learn anything I could from her. And at the time, I had a mobile value-added services business. So I was trying to sell SMS marketing and those kind of services. And I was basically pitching her on why she should be embracing the new technology of mobile tech. And she said to me, "Have you seen our website?" And I said, "No." And she said, "We don't have a website." What? Everyone has a website. And she said, "We don't need it. Everyone in the industry knows us. And I can assure you, we're making far more money than you are with your new tech." It was a big sort of eye opener to me that actually, a lot of these businesses, we look at them and kind of think that they're missing out on something, but actually they're doing incredibly well for what it is that they're doing. And so the companies that we work with, they're typically a couple of decades old. The founders have been in their industry for 20, 30 years. They know everyone, they know everything. And a private equity view would look at it and go, they're not using CRM, they've got a spreadsheet, this is all very rudimentary, and would go in and sort of put in these incredibly complicated systems and processes and just kill the business in the meantime. And the reality is new tech businesses make up a tiny, tiny fraction of the economy. Now, yes, there's one or two of them that go on and make huge differences, but the next level up is these boring businesses. So 50% of the world's economy, like 90% of private sector employment, is these dull, boring, middle of the road businesses. And then you get into sort of 200 million and above, which is where private equity and the public markets generally take over. And weirdly, from our world of the sort of finance space, there is no financial product that allows you to have exposure to half the world's economy. Like you can invest in real estate, you can invest in stocks or bonds, but you can't invest in half the world's economy.
I think there's a tendency for us, even as founders or as people going into a company to fix certain problems maybe, or look for growth, we land up creating these complicated systems. This is a very selfish question because I think I complicate things just in general. And I feel like a perspective would be really important here. So what have you seen that has happened where people go in and complicate things when it could be done quite simply?
I think the easiest way to think about this, and you will be very familiar with this, is, the world of entrepreneurs that decide that they want to be an entrepreneur, and they will obsess about tiny details on what color should their logo be, what should their website, what system should it be on, what CRM should they use, Asana, should they use Slack, like obsessing about these things before they've ever gone and spoken to a client. all the good entrepreneurs, they have an idea, they turn and talk to the first person they meet and they say, would you give me 10 grand if I make this happen for you? No website, no CRM system, no task management, no, like all of that sort of stuff. So I think that's a very obvious sort of thing that you see at sort of entry level. You don't see it so much in the small, good businesses. You then see it again in bigger businesses when consultants come in, because they now need to justify their jobs by making everything complicated again. It's right at the beginning and it's right at the end, but neither of them are particularly good for business. Simplicity is always.
My first business, I had already put 260 grand into the restaurant before I even opened the door, and someone paid me $10 for this first meal. I remember it so clearly. I remember the person's face. And then going through the Key Person of Influence program and understanding these things where you first see whether the market actually wants what this great idea you think you have and how clever you are, right? And Amplify and We Are Podcast has been built on that. I literally did exactly that, did not have a website for our first 22 clients. I just went out and said, hey, I'm thinking, this is 11 years ago when no one knew what a podcast was, right? I was trying to explain to people that this is going to add value to their business. And this follows up really well into my next question.
Hey, it's Mick Hawes, host of The Toolshed. I love making my podcast, and that's primarily because Ronsley has helped me avoid a whole bunch of really basic mistakes that would have cost me a whole bunch of time, money, and energy. And Rons has compiled a list of these mistakes and how to avoid them, which is really a steal. You can get your copy where I downloaded mine at mistakes.wearepodcast.com. That is mistakes.wearepodcast.com. We Are Podcast. You can't find your voice if you don't use it.
And just in general, we have all these businesses functioning and we're trying to pay attention to what are tiny details like logos and colors and fonts, because some people have said that how you do one thing is how you do everything, or whatever we've taken, right? And we've started obsessing on these things. But genuinely, because you've seen so much in your 25 years and now especially what you're doing, what are the things that adds value to businesses?
So there's a really important distinction there when you talk about adds value. And because there's two types of value in a business. There's client value or customer value, and there's shareholder value. So the way I learned this lesson was I was a struggling entrepreneur, completely obsessed with my own business, trying to figure everything out. Somebody came to me and said, would you like to buy our business? I didn't have any money. I didn't have any time, but I thought, if they think I'm good enough, then why get to kind of have a look inside and see what somebody else's business is like. So I went and kicked the tires of that business. And I remember going around with the owner and I said, I don't understand why you keep serving this client. And he said, oh, look, it's the first client we ever had. I know we lose money every time, but it's the first client. I can't fire them. And I was like, okay, I understand. And I said, what about her? What does she do? She doesn't really do anything, but like everyone in the office loves her, so I can't really fire her either. And I was like, if I bought the company, I would fire both of them. He's like, yeah, but you can do that. I can't do that. And I walked out of that meeting and it's, guy's an idiot. Like, he's so worried about things that are not important. And I went back to my own business with this kind of new set of glasses on. And I saw clients that I was serving that lost me money. And I saw people in my office that really shouldn't be there. And I realized that as entrepreneurs, we're constantly thinking about client value all day, every day. How can we add more value? How can we charge more? How can we find more ways? It's all about adding value for the client. And we assume that we understand shareholder value because we're 100% the shareholder. It's all for us. So making the client happy must be good for us. And actually, if you start looking at it in the realms of what your business is worth to a potential buyer, oftentimes, if you obsess too much about client value, you end up depriving yourself of shareholder value. Now, the extreme of this is what private equity does. Private equity comes in and says, we don't care about the client. We're going to cut back the cost to the barest minimum. We're going to cut back the service. We're going to go the complete other way. Shareholder value ramps up. Client value ramps down. Now, that's not a sustainable path. Eventually that falls over, but they'll flip the business before that. So it was a massive eye opener to me to always keep clear. And actually what I did, I often would bring in another investor, even over for a small percentage, just to help keep me focused on shareholder value rather than client value. So yeah, that's a really important distinction, I think.
Yeah, great distinction. And even when you mentioned it, took me a while to kind of go client value, shareholder. But when you said it, I was like, of course, we kind of focus on this value system that we should be paying attention to, but we focus on this. In fact, a common friend of ours, Mike Reed, I remember so clearly, this was 2017. I'd say, Amplify got past $1 million business, and I think we just got to like 15 or 16 people team. And I remember like having this conversation with him over lunch, and the way he said it to me, because I was having some issues in the business and in terms of team. And he said, so really your business is just fat and you're just letting it become fat. And the way he said, I'll never forget the way he expressed that, because he was like, you're just lazy, your business is getting lazy and you're making it fat. I was like, oh, thank you, Mike. I will never forget that lesson. Let's talk about podcasting, because, adding value to the business, whether it's client value or shareholder value, I'm sure when a brand or a business has a voice and, puts itself out there in different ways, there's a value add that comes with it. What have you seen? And then let's talk about your podcast and how uniquely you've built that.
So actually this kind of journey came about because of KPI. So I had built a bit of a personal profile as an entrepreneur prior to the 2008, 2009 global financial crisis. I was doing well. I owned a few businesses. I had about 40 staff. And then my two biggest clients defaulted on over $1 million each and just destroyed me. And I ended up having to lay off 38 of 42 staff, and just horrendous. And the last thing I wanted was to have smiling images of me everywhere going, yeah, everything's great. So I basically got rid of most of my online presence at that point. And then talking to Dan about helping him bring KPI to Asia. And I was like, I'm not allowed to be a secret person bringing a program called Key Person of Influence, but am I? And he's like, no, I really need you to build your profile up again. So started doing that. And I was also looking for KPIs. How could I help them get more exposure? And another thing that was kind of frustrating me is I've been based in Asia for 20 years. The world's obsessed with Silicon Valley. And yet there's so many cool entrepreneurs doing cool stuff that just don't get any coverage. And it was really frustrating me because I knew these cool people and I thought they should be getting exposure. So I wrote to people like Forbes and Inc. and Esquire, a few people and said, look, I'm this business guy. I've got a great network. I've written for a few publications in the past. I will feature these entrepreneurs. I'll do like a monthly profile of entrepreneurs doing cool stuff in Asia. And it's been about 10 years. I still haven't heard back from them, but I imagine that, they're busy. They like kind of thought, okay, I'm going to have to lower my expectations a bit. I lowered it and I went through like a second tier magazine, and the second tier magazine came back straight away and they said, yeah, we've actually read your publication. We'd love to have you, but instead of monthly, could you do weekly? Because we're kind of short on content. And so I facetiously wrote back, what about daily? And they went, yeah, that'd be great. Thanks. And I so now, but then I thought, well, this is kind of an interesting thing, because if I could actually do an interview with someone daily, that would be amazing network. So I ended up having to I systemize this whole thing where people would get a Google Doc. So you, Ronsley, would get an email from somebody saying, hey, I think you should be getting more publicity for what you're doing. You fill in the answers to these questions. You recommend 3 people that are doing cool stuff that are under-recognized. They would then automatically get emails from you, and like this whole thing kind of spawned off. And today we've done like 3,000 interviews with people, and people get amazing results from it. An idea from my wife about something that I'd seen. We were chatting about it, and basically came up with this idea of doing a micro podcast. And a micro podcast basically is there's one question and there's one answer. So basically we target, it used to be entrepreneurs, it's now broader to leaders. And the question is something along the lines of what's the most important leadership lesson that you've learned? So what happens now is people go to this website, they fill in their details, they upload their photo, they press a record button, they answer that. They've got up to 4 minutes to answer that. They hit submit. It goes off to my editor, tops and tails it, sticks some music, puts it out, and that's it. People love listening to it. In fact, when Tesla launched in Singapore, for some reason, our podcast ended up as being the first podcast that they shows on the Tesla thing, Callum Connects. And because it's kind of like little bite-sized clips of goodness of people's key lessons. And again, it's just me being really lazy, but helping
And
people get.
It's so unique because what you've done, if someone came to me and said, I want you to help me do a podcast, everything you've done are things that I would advise against. A podcast is so easy to consume. The person is connected to your brand for that long. So make it as consumable as possible. But also, the biggest power of a podcast is this conversation and this relationship building that happens. It's like a business development tool. You've got to be there because if you're having all these people there, you can create these relationships, and you've kind of done exactly the opposite. And you're not the first person, by the way, you know. There's lots of people and they remind me when they come on the show, you suggested I do the opposite and I've done the opposite and it worked for me. Let's talk about this, right? How the lazy person's guide to starting a podcast to add value to the business. So what happens before you begin the before they begin the recording? What happens during and what happens after?
It all starts with the premise of how do you add value? So I'm adding value for them because they're getting the chance to be on a podcast that they might not have been on before. And it's once you get on one podcast, it's much easier to get on other podcasts. And they can then go out to their network and say, hey, I was on this podcast. And it works for me because when they go through this process, often this is the first time they've heard about me. So then they go, well, who is this Callum guy that's set this up? And I've got loads of leads from that. You would get an email that says, hey, look, Kevin was on a podcast. He thinks you might be good for this podcast too. If you're interested, just go here. It'll only take 5 to 10 minutes of your time. You go to a landing page, you upload your information, you record it. Don't like it, you record it again. Like you can do it as many times as you like. You can listen back to it. Once you hit submit, just auto sends, and then you get a series of follow-up emails.
So what about like repurposing and stuff like that? Do you do any of that? Do you do any show notes or any images or reels or anything else? Or is just the podcast that goes out?
We put it onto YouTube, and surprisingly, it kind of gets quite good coverage on YouTube. I have a guy doing my YouTube channel now who was really grumpy at how dull they were because it's just like a picture and the audio for 3 or 4 minutes. So he's now trying to jazz them up to see whether it makes any difference. So yeah, we're sort of playing around with a few other bits and pieces, but I can do that now because I have somebody permanently doing my YouTube content.
So let's talk about the results, right? So you mentioned leads. What has that done from a business standpoint or from a personal brand standpoint? Can you look back and say, these are the things we've been able to achieve as a result of having this podcast?
Personal brand is all about an ecosystem. Like it's very difficult to kind of pinpoint one thing or another thing. I'll give you an example. So we've got a new book coming out at the moment called Boardroom Blueprint, How to Get Your First Board Seat. And I got a review from somebody, like a pre-review. So I went out to my mailing list. This woman wrote this incredible review. And so I just sent an email back saying thanks. And it turns out she had been on my podcast about 1.5 years ago. They like watching everything that I've been doing, loved what I was doing. She's got a whole big network that she wants to push the book out to when it's ready. So there's a lot of those kind of little things where, you know, somebody does the podcast, maybe they've done like the full form interview, these videos on YouTube. The way I've always looked at it with both the long form interviews and the podcasts is me getting benefit as a secondary. I need to make sure the individual gets benefit from it. And what I found really interesting actually, and a lot of people obsess about getting really good distribution. Like you've got to have like expert distribution. So one of the things I noticed both with the podcast and with these interviews is we've got kind of the same distribution as everyone else. It's not massive. We're not kind of like number one anywhere or anything like that. But what was happening is I was getting these emails back from people that had done them saying, my God, like you published the interview last week. I've already been offered like investment. Somebody asked me to speak at their conference. I'm thinking, how's this happening? Because we're not pushing it out to that many people. That seems weird. And what I realized was that when people get published, they then share that on Facebook or to their newsletter list or to their friends. And oftentimes, especially with the interviews, most of our immediate network has no idea what we do. Like, you're the guy that does something in podcasting. Like, I'm the guy who does something with public companies and stuff, right? They don't really know. So when they actually see an interview where you talk about what you've done and how you feel and like the stuff, like personal stuff about you, oftentimes it's the first time they've actually gone, I should put you in touch with this person, or you'd be perfect for this. And so actually they were getting incredible results, but not through my network, through their own network, because it was the first time they'd articulated that stuff. So it was a really interesting kind of eye opener to me on the power of that.
Yeah. I mean, that's really unique. I've done, believe it or not, 1,500, 1,600 interviews now. And that's the first time I've actually heard that sort of, stance on how a podcast can be used so differently by the people that have been on the podcast, almost boost their own network. And this is something that I've also learned from key person of influence, but I think I heard the line somewhere else. As a business owner, you get asked one question the most, but you're not prepared for it, which is, what do you do? And we just don't know how to answer it. And we say all these vague things because we talk about everything but the actual thing. I'm conscious of time, so I want to land this plane, but I want to ask you this question considering a bunch of different things. You're best-selling author of 3 books, 3 business books. You're coming out with Boardroom Blueprint, which means that, you've seen things from a boardroom perspective, which means you can advise people to add value to the business at the boardroom level. What are some of the hacks that you've seen that can actually be beneficial for us that have businesses and can actually take action on some of these things?
The Boardroom Blueprint thing came about because I set up a business about 1.5 years ago to help women, minorities, and first timers to get board seats. And what I realized, because I had sat on numerous boards and advised numerous boards, and predominantly full of old white men that have kissing contests with each other, and like half of them don't deserve to be there. And it was a pretty poor experience. And I knew that there were really talented people that were missing out on this. And so there's 2 elements of it. Most people kind of have this idea of, okay, in 20 years' time, someone will tap me on the shoulder and offer me a board seat. What I showed in the book and what we do in our program is say, there's a company out there right now that could really benefit from your experience and your connections. And you will build up the board experience, but you've got to get in the door first. So what we teach is, how do you get in the door? On the other side of that, how you get in the door is what I've said to small businesses for many, many years is get an advisory board. Like, first thing you do, put a bunch of advisors around you, because even if they gave you terrible advice, just the credibility of having an advisory board, just the accountability of having someone that can just, you can report to in terms of what you're doing is so valuable. And so basically what we teach our clients to do is to go and create advisory boards for small businesses. Like, the next step up is to get yourself an apprenticeship on a publicly listed board. Use that to get yourself an actual board seat on a publicly listed company. And it can move incredibly quickly. And we had people within months are getting, like, we said one guy joined us within 4 months. He turned down an S&P 500 board seat for $168,000 a year because he had got 3 other board seats and he was having too much fun on them. And for a man like yourself, with the connections that you've got, there would be tons of companies that would love to have you on the board, but they won't touch you because you haven't got board experience. So it's just kind of get over that initial hurdle. Suddenly you're hugely valuable.
Ladies and gentlemen, CallumLaing.com is where you're going to find all the cool stuff that he's up to. We'll have that link in the show notes as well. congratulations on the book. Is it the 4th time you're writing a book? Well done. I'm writing my 2nd book right now, and there are days that I'm enjoying myself and the days that I want to pull my hair out.
The last 10% is the worst as well. We've still got that to come.
Thank you for reminding me of what is to come, Callum. It's been a pleasure, as always, to connect and have this conversation. Thanks, mate.
Thank you so much for listening. Listen to the back catalog of over 300 episodes by going to wearepodcast.com. If you're looking for something specific, let the We Are Podcast team point you in the right direction. Send us an email on podcast@wearepodcast.com. Also, if you know a business owner who has a podcast, ask them to listen. Share an episode with them. The conversations here are going to save them lots of trial, error, time, and money. Until next week, much love.